The word frost doesn't sound dangerous. It sounds like a children's book, like something on a weather app next to a small blue snowflake icon, like the kind of warning people scroll past without slowing down. It doesn't belong in the same category as wildfire or flood or hurricane, even though, in terms of the damage it can do to the systems that feed the planet, it probably should. Because behind that mild, almost decorative word is a mechanism capable of wiping out an entire season's harvest in a single night, collapsing the economy of a farming region and nudging food prices upward on the other side of the world. A frost doesn't flatten buildings. It rarely makes the evening news the way a hurricane does. It works quietly, at the cellular level, in the exact hours when a plant is least able to defend itself, because it has already done everything biology told it to do: opened its flowers, pushed out new leaves, trusted the air temperature that, only days earlier, was saying something completely different. What follows is not a story about one bad season. It's a story about a mechanism that has, for a long time, been treated as a rare and forgivable accident, and about the mounting evidence that it is becoming something closer to a recurring feature of the climate system. And it's a story about what's actually driving that shift. It's worth pausing on why this particular threat is so easy to underestimate compared with other forms of climate disruption. A wildfire produces smoke visible from space. A flood leaves a waterline on a wall that stays there for years. A frost leaves almost nothing behind by the time the sun comes up. The blossoms that were killed overnight often still look intact for a day or two before they brown and drop. And by the time the damage becomes visually obvious, the event that caused it is already old news, if it was news at all. That gap between cause and visible consequence is part of why frost has remained, for most people outside agriculture, a background weather detail rather than a climate risk worth tracking closely. Before going further, it's worth being clear about the frame of this conversation, because climate topics tend to slide toward one of two unhelpful extremes: alarm or dismissal. This isn't a story about the end of agriculture, and it isn't a story that late frosts are nothing new and nothing to think about. It's an attempt to lay out, as precisely as the current science allows, what a late frost actually does, why it seems to be hitting harder and in more places than it used to, where the scientific consensus is solid, where it is still being debated, and what farmers, insurers, and policymakers can realistically do about it. Start with the physics, because without it, nothing that follows makes sense. A plant cell is, in essence, a small sack of water carrying dissolved sugars, salts, and a long list of organic compounds. That water determines whether the cell survives a cold snap. When a temperature drop happens gradually, the plant has time to respond. Water migrates out of the cell into the spaces between cells, where it can freeze without doing much damage, while the cell itself shrinks and slips into a kind of managed pause. This is a slow, evolved process that plants have relied on for a very long time. The trouble starts when the temperature falls fast, a swing of 10 or 15 degrees Celsius within a matter of hours, with no time for the plant to adjust. In that scenario, water freezes directly inside the cell. Needle-shaped ice crystals puncture the cell membrane from within. The contents leak out, and the cell dies, permanently. This is exactly what farmers see the next morning after a hard freeze. Blackened, limp, water-soaked leaves and shoots that look almost as though they'd been scalded rather than frozen. What happens next depends heavily on where the plant's growing point sits. In cereal crops, during the early stages of development, this point, the tissue from which all future leaves, stems, and eventually the grain head will form, typically sits at or just below the soil surface. Soil acts as a natural insulator. Even when air temperatures drop well below freezing, the temperature a few centimeters underground tends to stay much closer to zero. That's often enough for the growing point to survive, even if everything above ground is killed outright. The plant loses yield potential, but it doesn't die. It can push out new growth from that surviving point. The problem is that once the stem elongates and the growing point rises above the soil line, that built-in protection disappears completely. And this is exactly where the modern climate starts working against the plant. Unusually warm late winters and early springs, now common across much of the temperate world, accelerate early development. The growing point rises above ground earlier than it did 20 or 30 years ago. Then a cold snap arrives. And in today's atmosphere, that can happen almost any time in spring, regardless of what the historical calendar says. And it catches the plant at precisely the moment it's most exposed. That's not bad luck. It's a repeatable mechanism, and it appears to be triggering more often than it used to. Fruit trees face an even sharper version of this problem because the vulnerable tissue isn't the whole plant. It's the flower and the newly formed fruitlet, which is to say, the entire economic value of that year's crop. A tree doesn't wake from winter dormancy according to a calendar. It responds to accumulated warmth. Once the number of warm hours crosses a certain threshold, the biochemical machinery of flowering switches on, and the tree has no way of knowing what will happen a week later. It only reads the temperature of the moment. The problem is that the modern climate increasingly sends the go signal 2, 3, sometimes 4 weeks earlier than it did a few decades ago. The critical temperatures involved are strikingly small. An open apple blossom typically dies at around -2 degrees Celsius if the cold persists for half an hour or more. Peach blossoms are killed at roughly -1 degree. Apricot blossoms, among the most sensitive of the common stone fruits, can be lost at around -1.5 degrees. A young fruitlet, freshly formed after pollination, is usually even less cold-hardy than a fully open flower, and it can lose viability at temperatures the tree's leaves and shoots would shrug off without much trouble. The practical consequence of this arithmetic is blunt. A frost that leaves a tree looking perfectly healthy the next day can, at the same time, have wiped out the entire year's harvest. To understand why late frosts increasingly show up in places where, historically, they were statistically rare, it helps to look several kilometers up at the polar jet stream, the fast-moving river of air that circles the planet in the mid and high latitudes and largely determines whether cold Arctic air stays bottled up in the north or spills south into the regions that grow wheat, cherries, and grapes. The stronger the temperature contrast between the pole and the tropics, the straighter and more stable that river tends to be, and the more settled the weather in the mid-latitudes. It's worth being precise here, because the relationship between Arctic warming and jet stream behavior is one of the more actively debated questions in modern climate science, and the debate deserves to be represented honestly, rather than flattened into a simple story. On one side, research going back to climatologists Jennifer Francis and Stephen Vavris has argued that the Arctic, which is warming considerably faster than the planet as a whole, is reducing that pole-to-equator temperature difference, which should weaken the jet stream and make it wavier, producing large meanders that get stuck in place for days or weeks at a time. Several research groups have pointed to a rising number of these stalled, blocked weather patterns over recent decades as at least partial support for that idea. On the other side, a major international modeling effort known as the Polar Amplification Model Intercomparison Project, which ran dozens of climate models many times over, produced results that complicate the picture considerably. While Arctic sea ice loss is unambiguous and well documented, the models did not consistently reproduce a weaker, wavier jet stream as a direct result of that ice loss, at least not as cleanly as the earlier hypothesis suggested. That doesn't mean there's no connection. It means the atmosphere is an enormously complex system with many interacting variables. And climate science is being honest that some of the mechanistic details are still being worked out. What is not seriously disputed across most of this debate is the observed rise in the frequency of blocking weather patterns, situations where a given regime, whether warm or cold, gets stuck over a region for a week or two instead of clearing out within a few days. It's precisely those extended anomalies in either direction that create the greatest agricultural risk, because plants have time to respond to a long warm spell well before anyone can be sure what will follow it. One recent analysis of large-scale atmospheric wave patterns found that these amplified, slow-moving configurations, the kind that keep weather systems parked in place for days or even weeks, are now showing up roughly 3 times more often than they did in the 1950s. That finding doesn't automatically mean frosts themselves have become more numerous in absolute terms. In some regions, the date of the last spring freeze has actually been shifting earlier as winters warm overall, which could, in principle, reduce frost frequency somewhere down the line. But it does mean that when a frost does occur, it's more likely to arrive on the back of a sharp, stalled temperature contrast, rather than a gradual seasonal transition. And, as already discussed, it's precisely that sharpness of contrast that determines how much damage a plant actually sustains. Climate researchers, including those associated with the original jet stream hypothesis, are careful to note that the strength and year-to-year consistency of this effect remain open questions rather than settled conclusions. Still, the underlying rise in prolonged weather anomalies, regardless of exactly which mechanism is driving it, is documented consistently enough that agronomic and insurance models are already starting to build it into their risk assessments. There's a scene that repeats itself across very different countries every spring, and it's likely to keep repeating more often. An agronomist, or the farmer themselves, crouches in a field, carefully digs a few centimeters of soil away from the base of a young wheat plant, and presses a thumbnail into the crown, the small, swollen node at the base of the stem from which the plant can regrow if the leaves above ground have been killed. If the tissue is firm and pale on the cut surface, the plant will likely survive. If it's brown and mushy, that plant is done, no matter how green the field still looks from a distance. This isn't some folksy holdover from an earlier era of farming. Satellite imagery and weather stations can confirm that a cold snap occurred, but they can't reliably tell an agronomist whether the crown of a specific plant in a specific field made it through. In the spring of 2025, this kind of manual check was carried out across large stretches of southern Russia's farm belt after the region absorbed 2 separate waves of late frost in a single season. The first wave struck the Krasnodar region, Stavropol, Crimea, and Adygea, and regional authorities warned that up to half the stone fruit harvest, apricots, peaches, cherries, plums, was at risk. Growers' associations in Krasnodar estimated stone fruit losses at around 50% that spring, and the damage wasn't limited to orchards. Industry groups tracking sugar beet reported roughly 120,000 hectares of plantings affected nationwide, close to 12% of the area sown at that point in the season, with the heaviest losses concentrated in the Belgorod and Lipetsk regions. A year later, in the spring of 2026, the pattern repeated itself almost exactly. An unusually warm March again pushed crops into early growth, and by April, nighttime frosts were again recorded across parts of the country's European farm belt. Russia's National Union of Agricultural Insurers directly linked this recurrence to rising climate instability in crop production, and noted that cumulative insurance payouts tied to frost and winter kill damage over the preceding seasons had already exceeded 4.7 billion rubles. Behind these regional figures are individual operations, and one story from the spring of 2026 illustrates the pattern particularly well. A winery in Crimea's Sevastopol district, deliberately located in a natural basin chosen years earlier precisely because of its protection from cold air draining down from nearby hills, still wasn't spared. In April 2025, the estate lost roughly 90% of its primary buds in a single frost night, the first time in 18 years of operation that had happened, and the final harvest came in at only about 40% of a typical year. Over the following winter, the owners invested in 4 separate protective systems at once: heated candles placed among the vines, agricultural row cover fabric, a heating cable system, and sprinkler irrigation designed to coat the buds in a protective layer of ice. Even so, the cost of the equipment meant they could only cover a little more than half of their total vineyard area. The story is a useful illustration of a broader rule. Even serious, well-funded preparation rarely buys complete protection against late frost. It buys partial protection, which still leaves a meaningful share of the crop exposed. It helps to translate all of this into the arithmetic of a single farm, because the abstract statistics can obscure just how sharply one cold night can change a family's finances. Take a hypothetical apricot orchard of around 60 acres in a temperate foothill region. Establishing an orchard like this, saplings, drip irrigation, trellising, protective netting, typically runs somewhere between 20 and 30,000 euros per hectare. Money invested years in advance, with the operation only expected to reach full commercial productivity 5 to 7 years after planting. One frost night during full bloom, with temperatures dropping to -3 or 4 degrees Celsius for several hours, can destroy 80 to 90% of that year's fruit set. Instead of the 15 tons per hectare a healthy orchard might yield, the farm brings in 1.5 tons, maybe 2. Revenue drops by a factor of 5 to 10, but the season's operating costs, wages, pest control, fuel, packaging, stay essentially unchanged, because most of that work was already done in anticipation of a normal harvest. The result of one cold morning is an operating loss for the entire year, delayed loan payments, and another round of conversations with the bank about refinancing. If that kind of night happens 2 years running, most mid-sized family operations exhaust whatever cash reserves they had for covering ongoing costs. 3 years running, and conversations tend to shift towards selling the land or abandoning the crop entirely. It's the repetition, not any single catastrophic event, that ultimately determines whether an operation survives. That single cold night doesn't stop rippling outward once it has hit one farm. It spreads through the local economy in concentric circles. Processing plants that had already contracted for a certain volume of fruit either scale back operations or scramble to find more expensive supply elsewhere. Trucking companies that pre-booked refrigerated transport for the harvest season either reschedule or lose the contract outright. Seasonal laborers who traveled from other regions or countries specifically for the harvest find themselves without work earlier than planned and without the income they budgeted for. Local suppliers of everything from fertilizer to farm equipment lose a chunk of their annual revenue. Local governments collect less in tax revenue, which, in rural areas where agriculture is the dominant industry, tends to show up fairly quickly in funding for schools, roads, and clinics. None of these effects typically appear in standard damage estimates for a frost event, which are almost always limited to direct crop losses. But it's the sum of these secondary effects that determines how deeply a single weather event ends up reaching into a community, well beyond the boundaries of the orchards and fields it directly touched. The logical response to this kind of risk is insurance, and in theory it exists in most places where commercial agriculture is practiced. In practice, the insurance market responds to rising climate volatility in a fairly predictable, if unhelpful, way. Premiums are built on actuarial models that lean heavily on historical event frequency. The rarer an event has been historically, the lower the premium. When events that statistical models classified as once every 20 years start happening every 2 or 3 years instead, insurers respond by sharply raising premiums, introducing large deductibles, or simply exiting a given crop or region altogether. That pattern has shown up repeatedly in fruit-growing and wine-growing regions of southern Europe in recent years, where some insurers have excluded frost coverage during certain windows of spring, or narrowed the list of insurable crops after several loss-making seasons in a row. The paradox is that at exactly the moment when climate risk is objectively rising and the need for insurance protection is growing with it, the availability and affordability of that protection tend to move in the opposite direction. Smaller and mid-sized operations, with the least financial cushion to begin with, are usually the first to lose access to coverage, precisely when they need it most. The structure of insurance coverage that does exist matters just as much as whether it exists at all. In most European countries, crop insurance premiums are partially subsidized by the state, which pushes up the share of farms carrying a policy. Where that subsidy is absent or minimal, the picture looks different. In Germany, where crop insurance premiums are not subsidized at the federal level, frost coverage density has traditionally remained low, and after major frost events, the bulk of assistance to affected farms tends to come not from insurance payouts, but from separate regional relief programs. In other words, even within wealthy, agriculturally advanced countries, how protected an individual farmer actually is from climate risk often has less to do with the objective scale of the threat and more to do with quirks of the national subsidy system, a detail that rarely makes it into public conversations about climate adaptation, but that directly shapes who recovers quickly after the next cold snap and who doesn't. Wine growing deserves particular attention here because it's simultaneously one of the clearest beneficiaries of long-term warming and one of the industries most exposed to late frost. In cooler wine regions, parts of Germany along the Rhine, stretches of Central and Eastern Europe, decades of warming have brought genuine benefits: more consistent ripening, higher sugar content, the ability to produce wines with a level of maturity that, in earlier decades, was only achievable in exceptional years. But that same warming carries a sharp downside. Warm, late winters push vines to break dormancy earlier, and a young green shoot loses almost all the cold hardiness the dormant bud once had. A dormant vine can survive temperatures well below -20 degrees Celsius without damage. The same tissue, days after bud break, can be killed at -2 or 3 degrees. One of the most thoroughly documented examples of this dynamic is April 2021 in France, when an unusually warm March triggered early bud break across the country, and a sharp cold snap over several nights then swept through vineyards from Bordeaux and Burgundy to the Loire Valley and the Rhône. French officials later described the episode, according to multiple accounts, as one of the country's most significant agricultural disasters of the young century for the wine sector. Direct losses to wine growers, according to industry estimates, exceeded 2 billion euros, with individual appellations reporting losses of anywhere from 50 to 100% of their crop. Researchers with the World Weather Attribution Group subsequently connected the likelihood of that specific sequence, unusually early warmth followed by a hard freeze, to a changing climate. A cold April night is nothing new for France on its own, but the abnormally early bud break driven by that warm February and March was what left the vines exposed at a stage when, in earlier decades, they would still have been safely dormant. This is the thaw-freeze pattern agronomists increasingly point to. It isn't the cold itself that's unprecedented. It's the contrast between an anomalous warm spell and the sharp return of frost that follows it. That 2021 event, as severe as it was, turned out to be one link in a longer chain rather than an isolated anomaly. A similar 2-week cold spell in April 2017, also following an abnormally warm March, struck orchards and vineyards across several European countries simultaneously: Italy, France, Germany, Poland, Spain, and Switzerland. According to reinsurance company Munich Re, total economic losses from that event exceeded 3 billion euros, of which only around 600 million, roughly a fifth, was actually insured. That ratio says a great deal about the gap between real-world damage and insurance coverage in the industry. The overwhelming majority of the loss fell directly on growers who either had no policy or whose policy didn't cover an event of that scale. 3 years later, in 2024, a May frost hit vineyards in eastern and southwestern Germany, causing damage that one of the country's major insurers estimated in the tens of millions of euros, describing it as among the most severe frost events its claims specialists had seen in roughly 40 years of records. In some eastern German wine regions, as much as 80% of the vines were damaged. 3 episodes within less than a decade, each described at the time by people working in the industry as among the worst they'd ever witnessed. Don't by themselves prove a statistically airtight trend, but that kind of frequency has been enough to push the industry to reconsider long-held assumptions about how rare these events really are. There's one participant in the agricultural system that almost never comes up when people talk about frost, even though its condition affects the yield of an enormous range of crops, not directly, but through pollination. Honeybees begin large-scale foraging flights once air temperatures climb above roughly 10 to 12 degrees Celsius. Near freezing, they become immobile, and if caught outside the hive, they can die within a few hours. The failure mode here is straightforward. A few warm days in late April activate a hive. Thousands of foragers fan out in search of nectar and pollen from trees that bloomed earlier than usual because of an unusually warm spring. And then a sharp cold snap arrives. bees caught on blossoms or in the grass don't make it back to the hive in time and die where they are. A colony that loses a large share of its foraging population also loses the steady supply of nectar and pollen needed to raise new brood, and recovery typically takes 2 to 3 weeks. It's during that exact recovery window that other trees or varieties in the same orchard, ones the frost itself didn't directly damage, may come into bloom, with almost no pollinators available to service them. Researchers call this phenomenon phenological mismatch, biological cycles that evolved to stay synchronized through shared climate cues start drifting apart because those cues no longer arrive consistently or in the same order for every species involved.
According to estimates from the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization, roughly 3/4 of the world's leading food crops depend to some degree on insect pollination. The bulk of the world's fruits, berries, and many vegetables and oilseed crops, though staple grains like wheat and rice, which supply most of humanity's calories, are largely wind-pollinated and unaffected by this specific mechanism. That means the loss of foraging bees hits a narrower but still economically significant slice of the food system. Not the calories, but the nutritional diversity, the vitamins, minerals, and plant oils that come from the crops most dependent on insects. The economic value of that pollination service is typically estimated in the hundreds of billions of dollars annually worldwide, and it almost never shows up in official damage assessments after a frost event because a shortfall caused by missing pollinators doesn't announce itself the way a scorched blossom does. It shows up weeks later as fruit that simply never formed. From orchards and beehives, it's worth turning to a part of this story with far larger stakes: grain, and specifically the staple crops that most directly underpin global food security: wheat, corn, barley. Grain fields are measured not in acres, but in hundreds of thousands or millions of hectares, and losses here translate almost immediately into shifts in commodity markets. The 2025 to 2026 season in the United States offers a clear illustration, even though drought rather than frost was the dominant driver. Widespread dryness across the major hard red winter wheat regions of the southern Great Plains pushed that crop, according to USDA projections, to its smallest harvest since the 1957 to 1958 season, with total U.S. wheat production falling to its lowest level since the early 1970s. That's not a frost event specifically, but the underlying dynamic is identical. A temperate zone grain system operates on a fairly thin margin, where a regional weather anomaly translates almost immediately into shifts in the global balance sheet. Global wheat carryover stocks in the mid-2020s have generally been estimated somewhere in the range of 270 to 280 million tons, against annual global consumption approaching 820 to 825 million tons. Simple arithmetic puts that reserve at roughly 4 months of global consumption, a fairly thin cushion for a system that has to feed more than 8 billion people. Markets don't react to the absolute scale of a loss. They react to the balance between supply and demand, and when several major producing regions post even modest declines in the same season, the combined effect on global prices tends to be disproportionately large. This is exactly the mechanism that played out in 2010 to 2011, when extreme heat and drought hit several major grain exporting regions at once. Export restrictions followed in some countries, and world wheat prices climbed more than 70% within a few months. A shock felt by countries that had no direct connection to the original weather events, but still had to buy grain at world prices. Central Asia and southern Russia occupy a particularly interesting position in this picture.
because the region is simultaneously among the world's largest wheat exporters and directly exposed to the same volatility described throughout this story. A strong harvest there can help offset shortfalls elsewhere and keep global prices from spiking. But the same region has, in recent years, shown exactly the kind of instability described above. Warm early starts to the growing season, followed by return frosts, layered on top of periodic summer droughts. Which is why agricultural agencies in the region have increasingly warned about elevated and difficult-to-forecast risk stretching across much of the growing season, rather than being confined to the narrow calendar windows frosts were historically expected in. Any conversation about frost protection eventually runs into water. One of the most effective ways to shield blooming orchards and vineyards from moderate frost is a thin coating of ice created through continuous overhead sprinkling. The physics is simple. Freezing water releases heat, and that heat keeps the surface of buds and blossoms hovering near zero, even as the surrounding air drops well below it. But the method only works if water keeps flowing continuously for the entire duration of the cold snap. Stopping the irrigation for even a short period lets the ice begin cooling to ambient air temperature, killing exactly what it was meant to protect. For large commercial orchards spanning hundreds of hectares, a single frost night can require thousands of cubic meters of water. And if several cold nights occur in a row, that requirement multiplies. In regions already dealing with chronic water scarcity, parts of southern Europe, Central Asia, and the southwestern United States, that requirement often can't be met. Either the water physically isn't available, or its use is already restricted by regional regulations introduced in response to declining groundwater and river levels. The result is a collision between two separate climate pressures, each individually manageable, that together leave a farmer with almost no good option. The tool needed to defend against one threat becomes unavailable because of the other. Mountain agriculture deserves its own moment of attention because traditional risk management strategies here are starting to fail in ways distinct from what's happening on flatter terrain. For generations, farmers in Central Asia's mountain regions, the Caucasus, and similar high-elevation zones spread plantings across different altitude bands, specifically to hedge against localized weather extremes. If frost destroys an orchard at 8,000 feet, an orchard at 6,000 feet, where it's typically warmer, has a reasonable chance of surviving. This system relied on one dependable assumption: that each altitude band would stay within its characteristic temperature range. Current climate shifts are undermining exactly that assumption. Warming has pushed the boundaries of climate zones higher, opening up land for cultivation that was previously considered too cold, while sudden cold air intrusions, a hallmark of a less stable atmospheric circulation, sometimes reach elevations that were historically considered reliably protected. Over the past decade, several growing seasons in Central Asia's mountain districts have seen May frosts damage apricot and cherry orchards at elevations that had historically been treated as comparatively safe, precisely because of their cooler local microclimate. For farmers with little or no access to insurance, credit, or alternative income, that kind of failure in a traditional risk management system isn't just a disappointing season, it's a direct threat to the survival of the operation. It's worth stressing that vertical zoning itself isn't an outdated or naive practice. If anything, it remains one of the more sophisticated, time-tested strategies for managing climate risk in mountain regions, which is exactly why its partial breakdown is so disruptive. The issue isn't that traditional knowledge has stopped working. It's that the boundaries of climate zones are, in some years, shifting faster than farmers can adjust decades-old plantings. Since an apricot or cherry tree planted at a specific elevation for its specific microclimate can't simply be relocated. Unequal access to information and technology determines, more than almost anything else, who manages this risk well and who is left essentially defenseless. Weather forecasting has made real progress over the past 2 decades. Modern numerical atmospheric models can now predict the arrival of a cold air mass with practically useful accuracy 10 to 14 days in advance. And localized agrometeorological services can calculate frost probability for a specific field based on terrain, land use, and soil condition. A newer development layers machine learning models on top of traditional numerical forecasts. Trained on decades of historical temperature, humidity, and terrain data, these systems can meaningfully sharpen the predicted minimum nighttime temperature for a specific orchard or field compared with a broader regional forecast. For agriculture, that precision matters enormously, because the difference of 2 or 3 degrees between a district-level forecast and the actual temperature in a particular low-lying hollow is often exactly the difference between a saved crop and a lost one. Services like this are already commercially available in a number of countries with advanced agricultural sectors. But adopting them requires reliable internet access, a smartphone, and a certain baseline of digital literacy. Conditions that can't be assumed evenly across every part of the world with a strong farming tradition. The World Meteorological Organization has repeatedly published estimates on the economic value of investing in early warning systems for developing countries, suggesting that every dollar spent on this kind of infrastructure prevents somewhere between $5 and $15 in damage, one of the highest returns of any category of infrastructure investment. And yet, the density of weather stations across large parts of Africa, Central and South Asia remains far below what the World Meteorological Organization recommends. A farmer in a well-resourced agricultural region of Europe can pull up an hour-by-hour forecast for a specific field on a smartphone and know exactly when to switch on the sprinklers. A farmer in a remote mountain district often finds out about a frost from a neighbor after the damage is already done, with no account taken of local cold pockets, the low-lying hollows and basins where, on a clear, still night, cold air drains downhill and pools, creating temperatures 4 or 5 degrees colder than a slope just a few hundred meters away. Those same hollows are often exactly where orchards are planted, because the soil is good and the site is sheltered from wind, which is precisely what makes them the most frost-prone spots on the whole farm. That inequality rarely comes up in public conversations about climate adaptation, which tend to focus on large-scale global technologies and global solutions. But it's exactly this kind of field-level, night-level detail that determines who loses a crop and who has time to switch on protection a few hours before the critical temperature hits. Soil health rarely comes up in discussions of frost damage, even though its condition strongly shapes how quickly a crop recovers afterward. Soil is a living system, home to enormous numbers of microorganisms that convert organic matter into forms plants can actually use, and that help maintain soil structure and water retention. When a late frost penetrates an already warmed top layer of soil, it doesn't just hit plant roots. It hits that microbial community too, much of which has already become active with the arrival of spring warmth and has lost the cold tolerance mechanisms that protect it during true winter dormancy. That means that at exactly the moment young seedlings most need available nutrients to fuel a fast recovery, the soil's ability to supply them drops sharply. Observations from agronomists across several temperate regions over recent years point to a consistent pattern. Fields with rich organic matter and diverse microbial communities recover from frost noticeably faster than fields degraded by intensive tillage and years of heavy chemical inputs. That gap in recovery speed translates into differences in final yield that some field observations put in the range of 15 to 30%. This isn't an argument for or against any particular farming philosophy. It's a practical observation. Healthy soil is one of the most accessible tools available for building resilience to climate extremes, one that requires no advanced technology and that keeps working precisely when other protective measures fail. Rebuilding degraded soil to the point where it meaningfully speeds recovery from cold stress typically takes years of reduced mechanical and chemical disturbance, rather than a single season, so it can't be treated as a quick fix once spring has already arrived, which is exactly why it needs to be built into a farm's long-term strategy well in advance, rather than adopted as a reaction to a frost that has already caused its damage. Livestock rarely enter the conversation about frost at all, even though, for some operations, the losses are just as severe as anything happening in the fields. Spring is calving and lambing season across most temperate livestock operations, timed on the assumption that the ground has thawed and the first grass has come in. A newborn animal has almost none of the thermal regulatory capacity of an adult, minimal fat reserves, an immune system that hasn't fully developed. A sharp, sudden cold snap can cause hypothermia within hours. And in regions where at least part of the herd is kept on open or semi-open pasture, mountain districts of Central Asia, steppe regions across several continents, an unexpected frost in May can kill off a meaningful share of a season's newborns in a single night. The economics of losing young livestock differs from crop loss in one important way. It's spread out over time. A dead calf isn't just one animal lost this year. It's a lost breeding unit for the next 3 or 4 years. Lost future calves from that animal. Lost future income from milk or offspring sales. For a large commercial operation with thousands of head, isolated losses from a localized cold snap tend to disappear statistically into overall herd numbers. For a small family operation running a few dozen head, losing even a handful of newborns in one calving season can measurably slow herd growth for years, precisely because a small operation doesn't have the buffer of scale to absorb a targeted loss the way a larger one does. Forage takes a hit too. Perennial grasses and planted forage crops are especially vulnerable during their active spring growth phase, and a frost can set pasture recovery back weeks at the exact moment newly born animals most need reliable nutrition. Some of what frost destroys is fast and visible. A killed blossom, damaged seedlings, dead newborn livestock. It shows up in official statistics. But something else erodes more slowly and never gets recorded in any report. A farmer's confidence in their own understanding of the season. Knowledge passed down through generations, roughly when the last spring frost tends to arrive, when it's safe to transplant, when a particular variety of apricot typically blooms, gradually loses its predictive value. Growers who have spent 2 or 3 decades in their fields or vineyards, if you ask them not about loss figures, but about what has actually changed in how the work feels,
tend to describe something remarkably consistent across very different countries and without ever having spoken to one another. A season that used to fall cleanly into good or bad now sometimes manages to be both within a single month. Warm enough that bees are flying by February, then cold enough weeks later that a May frost destroys the bloom that early warmth encouraged. It's that erosion of predictability itself, more than any single statistic about rising risk, that many growers describe as the hardest part of the shift. A risk you understand can be planned for, priced, and insured. Unpredictability is much harder to manage, because a decision made to hedge against one scenario can turn out useless or even harmful against a different one. A grower who covers blooming trees with row cover fabric to guard against frost risks triggering a fungal outbreak under that same fabric if a sharp warm-up and high humidity follow right behind the cold. Younger people who grow up on family farms, watching several difficult seasons stack up in a row, more often decide against continuing the family operation and move to the city. A shift that would likely be happening anyway due to broader economic and demographic trends, but one that climate instability appears to be accelerating. And when a generation of farmers leaves, it takes with it a body of hyperlocal, often entirely undocumented knowledge about the microclimate of a specific piece of land. Knowledge that technology can only partially replace and can't quickly rebuild from scratch. Among the more genuinely encouraging threads in this story is the science of frost resistance in plants, which has seen real progress in recent years. The cellular mechanisms behind cold tolerance are reasonably well understood. Which proteins protect membranes from ice crystal damage? Which compounds lower the freezing point of cell fluid? Which genes control these processes? Modern gene editing tools open the door to precisely enhancing these existing defenses, and research underway at several leading agricultural research centers has demonstrated the basic feasibility of the approach. Experimental lines of certain fruit and cereal crops with improved bloom cold hardiness already exist under lab conditions, showing gains of 1 to 3 degrees Celsius in the critical damage threshold compared with the original varieties. A gain of 1 to 3 degrees might sound modest, but that's often exactly the margin separating a partially damaged crop from a completely destroyed one in a real-world frost event. There is one significant constraint: the path from a laboratory result to a commercially available variety that has cleared field trials, regulatory approval, and seed or nursery stock multiplication typically takes 10 to 15 years. That's a structural gap between the pace of climate change and the pace of agricultural technology adaptation, and it shows up in plenty of fields beyond this one. Running alongside gene editing research is more traditional plant breeding, crossing existing commercial varieties with wild or semi-wild relatives that have already evolved greater cold tolerance in the regions where they naturally grow. That approach moves more slowly than precision gene editing, but sidesteps the regulatory review that applies to genetically engineered products in many countries, which in practice sometimes makes it the faster route to an actual usable variety, despite seeming technologically less sophisticated. Neither approach on its own is likely to close the gap between the speed of climate change and the speed at which genuinely resilient varieties reach farmers, which is why most leading agricultural research programs are pursuing both simultaneously. The link between climate shocks in agriculture and broader social or political instability is one of the more thoroughly documented relationships in the social science of climate change, even though the causal chain involved is never simple or singular. The mechanism, broadly sketched, runs like this.
A drop in harvests across major producing regions pushes global food prices up, and for lower-income countries where food already accounts for a large share of household spending, often 40 to 50% or more, that isn't just a shift in where money gets spent, it's a real reduction in how much food people can actually afford. The extreme heat and drought that hit several major grain exporting regions in 2010, the export restrictions that followed in some of those countries, and the sharp rise in world wheat prices in the following months are widely regarded by researchers as one contributing factor, among several, layered into the string of social protests that spread across parts of North Africa and the Middle East in the following year. It's worth being precise here. Social and political upheaval is always the product of multiple overlapping causes, and reducing it to a single trigger would be an oversimplification. But a climate shock to the food system has repeatedly turned out to be one of the real, statistically detectable factors feeding into more complex chains of events. Applied to synchronized late frosts across several grain-producing regions, the same logic holds, and it's worth separating it into distinct levels rather than treating it as a single blur. At the local level, individual farms and regional economies absorb direct losses. At the national level, countries that rely on agricultural exports lose a share of foreign currency earnings, while countries dependent on food imports have to spend more of their reserves to cover the shortfall, adding pressure to their balance of payments. At the global level, even moderate simultaneous losses across several major producing regions can combine into significant pressure on world commodity prices. Pressure felt by countries that had no connection whatsoever to the original weather event. The countries most exposed at this third global level aren't necessarily the poorest in absolute terms, but rather those where food already accounts for an unusually large share of household spending, since that's exactly where rising prices for staples like bread translate quickly and directly into reduced food security, rather than simply being absorbed by reshuffling a household budget. This layered structure also explains why the same frost event can register as barely noticeable in one country and as a serious hardship in another. A wealthier importing nation with diversified food sources and functioning social safety nets can usually absorb a price spike without it translating into measurable hardship. A household there simply pays somewhat more for bread and moves on. A lower-income importing nation with limited diversification and weaker safety nets absorbs the same price spike very differently, because there's far less slack in the system to begin with. This is one of the reasons climate researchers increasingly argue that food system resilience needs to be assessed at the level of specific countries and even specific households, rather than through global averages that can make a serious regional hardship look statistically minor. Frost rarely arrives in isolation from the rest of a society's infrastructure, and that's part of why its impact often ends up larger than the raw temperature drop alone would suggest. Utility and energy systems in many regions shift into a summer mode on a fixed calendar rather than in response to actual conditions. Heating reserve capacity gets scaled back. Emergency crews get reduced. Road maintenance departments put anti-icing equipment into off-season storage. When temperatures unexpectedly drop below freezing in early May and stay there for several days, demand for heating snaps back to winter levels, while the system isn't built to handle it, which tends to produce outages and sharp spikes in spot energy prices. Agricultural supply chains face a similar bottleneck. Sudden demand for row cover fabric, heating candles, and other frost protection supplies at volumes that simply can't be met on short notice. means the resource that could have saved part of a crop is physically unavailable at the exact moment it's needed. Road and airport infrastructure runs into the same problem. Road crews shifted to warm weather operations without de-icing equipment on hand are unprepared for sudden black ice, and airports have to scramble to reinstate aircraft de-icing procedures designed for winter, with all the associated costs and flight delays that come with it. The people hit hardest by these knock-on effects are often the most vulnerable groups in any given area. Older residents and people without stable housing, caught wearing spring clothing exactly when temperatures snap back to winter levels, with seasonal homeless outreach services staffed according to the calendar rather than the actual weather, unprepared for an unplanned May surge in demand for winter-level shelter. None of these effects looks, on the surface, connected to a frost in an orchard or a wheat field, but they're all part of the same underlying picture. A society whose infrastructure is built around dependable seasonality becomes exposed precisely in the moments when that seasonality breaks down. Any weather shock tends to act as an amplifier of existing inequality, and frost is no exception. That shows up on several levels simultaneously. Access to reliable, high-resolution forecasting and early warning is distributed very unevenly across countries and regions. Access to protective technology, sprinkler systems, wind machines, row cover fabric, requires real capital investment that large agribusinesses can typically absorb and small family operations often cannot. Access to insurance, as already discussed, tends to shrink fastest exactly where and when it's needed most. The ability to weather a bad season and recover also depends heavily on scale. A large operation can offset losses through diversification and credit lines, while a small family farm, after one or two difficult seasons in a row, often starts selling off assets. One frequent downstream effect of this dynamic, seen across several regions, is a gradual consolidation of farmland. Land vacated by smaller operations that couldn't absorb repeated losses tends to get bought up by larger players, which reduces the diversity of approaches to farming a given landscape. And that diversity is, on its own, one of the more underappreciated forms of resilience in a food system. It's worth stepping back from fields and orchards for a moment and looking at this entire chain from the perspective of an ordinary shopper in a supermarket, because that's ultimately where this story becomes visible to most people, if it becomes visible at all. A price spike on a particular variety of cherries or apricots mid-season rarely registers as the downstream consequence of a specific frost night hundreds or thousands of miles away weeks earlier. Between a frost in an orchard and a price tag on a shelf sits a long chain of intermediaries. Wholesale buyers, processors, logistics companies, retailers, each one absorbing part of the shock and passing part of it along. What the shopper ultimately sees isn't the cause, it's just the outcome: a thinner selection in a given category and a higher price on what remains, with almost no visible thread connecting it back to a weather event a month earlier. That invisibility, the disconnect between a specific climate event and daily life in a city far removed from the affected region, is part of why the topic of frost has stayed a largely industry-specific concern, rather than commanding the kind of broad public attention given to floods or wildfires, which are simply far more visible to an outside observer. Let's return to what's happening at the base of this entire mechanism, the state of Arctic sea ice, since it shapes much of what comes next. The extent of sea ice recorded by satellites at the end of each summer melt season continues to decline. And despite year-to-year fluctuations, the long-term trend is well established and not seriously contested within the scientific community. This isn't just a symbolic or aesthetic loss. Open ocean water absorbs far more solar energy than reflective white ice does, and as the ice retreats, that absorption increases, accelerating regional warming. Exactly how that feeds into the future behavior of the jet stream and the frequency of blocking weather patterns is, as already discussed, a question where meaningful scientific debate remains about the details and strength of the connection. Even as the broader direction of the process, a warming Arctic, shrinking ice cover, a rising number of prolonged weather anomalies, is documented with a fair degree of consistency. Climate models suggest that, under current emissions trajectories, the Arctic could see its first essentially ice-free summer in several million years of Earth's history within the coming decades. What that means for atmospheric circulation can't be pinned down with full precision, and that uncertainty exists for a specific reason, not a lack of data or scientific rigor, but a fundamental property of the climate system itself. The atmosphere, ocean, sea ice, and land surface are all linked through a web of feedback loops, some amplifying an initial change and others dampening it. And which of these dominates in a given region and season even isn't always predictable, even with powerful supercomputer models. That's exactly why climate science tends to speak in terms of a range of plausible scenarios with varying degrees of confidence, rather than a single forecast, an approach that feels unfamiliar to a public used to expecting a clean yes or no answer, but one that more honestly reflects the actual state of scientific understanding today. That uncertainty doesn't mean the problem isn't real. It means preparation needs to account for a wide range of plausible outcomes, rather than betting on a single, average scenario. It's worth saying a few words about who, within the global financial system, sees this entire picture at once, rather than region by region. The large international reinsurance companies, for whom accounting for climate risk has long since stopped being an optional talking point and become central to the business itself. Reinsurers were among the first to publicly note that the frequency of costly agricultural disasters tied to frost, drought, and other weather extremes is rising faster than the historical risk models built over previous decades can keep up with. Their assessments carry particular weight precisely because they come not from climate activists or individual affected farmers, but from institutions whose entire function is estimating the probability of future losses as accurately as possible, since their own profitability depends directly on getting that estimate right. When companies like this start talking publicly about the need to revise crop insurance models and raise premiums for specific regions and crops, it's worth treating that not as alarmism, but as a market signal. Capital is already pricing in a higher probability of climate disruption than casual public perception tends to assume. There's a structural feature of how people and institutions perceive climate risk worth naming directly. Both tend to respond seriously only once a threat becomes undeniable through direct experience, and by that point, it's already too late to prepare for it in advance. Applied to late spring frost, preparation means a fairly specific and, for the most part, already well understood set of steps at different levels. For an individual farmer, that means having row cover fabric in stock before the season starts, rather than scrambling for it the night before a cold snap. Subscribing to a professional agrometeorological service that provides 10 to 14-day warning. Having access to a credit line that can be drawn on immediately rather than weeks after applying. and diversifying crops as much as the operation reasonably allows. For a region or a national government, it means dense networks of weather stations capable of producing genuinely localized forecasts. Subsidy programs that help small operations afford protective technology. Insurance programs with premiums recalculated annually against the actual current level of climate risk rather than once a decade. And rapid response relief funds that don't require months of bureaucratic processing. For international institutions, it means funding meteorological infrastructure in developing countries as one of the most cost-effective tools available for climate adaptation, and building mechanisms to transfer frost protection technology to places that can't develop or purchase it on their own. A meaningful share of these measures is already being implemented, unevenly and with varying degrees of consistency across different countries. The problem isn't a shortage of solutions, it's that the pace of implementation still hasn't caught up with the pace at which the underlying risk is growing. This contrast between farms that prepared in advance and those reacting after the fact shows up clearly in the Crimean winery case mentioned earlier. It was the catastrophic loss of 2025 that directly triggered the decision to install 4 separate protection systems for the following season. A decision made under the pressure of an already realized loss, not as part of calm, long-range planning. That's a fairly common pattern. Serious investment in protection tends to follow the first painful event rather than precede it, which means the first destructive episode in a given region tends to catch operations unprepared, almost by definition. And only after it does, the adaptation cycle really begin. The role of higher-level systems, regional, national, international, is to shorten that inevitable first cycle of learning through loss for as many operations as possible. By providing access to information, technology, and financial tools before their own catastrophic night arrives. Meteorology relies on the concept of a climate normal, averaged figures for temperature, precipitation, and the frequency of extreme events calculated over a standard 30-year period and used as the baseline against which anomalies are measured. That tool is currently going through something of a credibility crisis. Conditions over roughly the last 5 to 7 years in many regions diverge noticeably from what the averaged 30-year record would predict, and that gap systematically understates real risk wherever decisions still rely on the older baseline. A farmer relying on the historical probability of a May frost is working with information that's gradually losing its predictive accuracy. An insurer pricing a policy off historical event frequency ends up with an underestimated risk. An infrastructure planner working off decades-old design standards may end up building something inadequate for the conditions it will actually face 20 years down the road. A number of national weather services have, in recent years, begun shifting toward continuously updated, living climate baselines that more accurately reflect the current state of the climate system rather than a multi-decade historical average. That takes more resources to maintain, but it produces a far more accurate basis for decisions across a wide range of sectors, from building codes to agricultural planning. The question that comes up most often in this conversation is whether things will get worse. The most defensible answer available from current data is this. If current greenhouse gas emissions trends continue, the average frequency of late spring frost events in the most exposed regions will likely keep rising, and their unpredictability in terms of timing and intensity appears likely to persist or even intensify. While climate science itself is careful to note that the precise rate of this increase and the exact regional differences involved remain active areas of research rather than a fully settled conclusion. Particularly exposed are regions where several risk factors overlap at once. Heavy reliance on crops with high sensitivity during the flowering stage, limited access to protective technology and insurance, and a growing water deficit that constrains the option of protective irrigation. If it's useful to sketch a rough map of where these overlapping risk factors converge, it isn't a list of places doomed to disaster so much as a set of recurring combinations. One combination involves fruit and wine growing regions of southern and central Europe, where water scarcity increasingly limits the option of protective irrigation at exactly the moments it's most needed. A second involves the mountain farming districts of Central Asia and comparable high elevation regions, where the traditional system of vertical zoning is starting to break down, and weather station density remains sparse compared with lowland areas. A third involves the major temperate grain belts, including southern Russia, Kazakhstan, and the northern Great Plains of North America, where a single frost event rarely causes catastrophic local damage on its own, but where the sheer scale of the land involved turns even moderate, widespread losses into a meaningful factor for global grain prices. None of these regions is guaranteed to suffer a disaster in any given year. Conditions can and do turn out fine in a specific season, as happened across parts of southern Russia in 2026, where advanced preparation by many operations helped limit losses despite another round of return frosts. But the accumulated record from recent years shows that the odds of an unfavorable outcome are higher than average precisely where these risk factors overlap, which is exactly why investment in early warning, insurance, and protective technology delivers the greatest return in those specific places. For regions carrying this combination of risk factors, the real question isn't whether a catastrophic late frost will happen again. Events like this are already occurring on a fairly regular basis, but whether local farming, insurance, and government systems manage to adapt before the next one arrives. Adaptation doesn't mean eliminating the risk entirely. Fully removing climate instability from the picture would require reducing atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations, which is a long-term project whose results won't show up for decades. Adaptation means reducing vulnerability to events that are, at this point, already unavoidable. And unlike full-scale climate stabilization, that is technically, financially, and institutionally achievable today. The image worth returning to at the end of this story is the same one it opened with. A farmer or agronomist crouched over a young wheat plant, pressing a thumbnail into the crown to find out whether the growing point is still alive. That image applies to more than a single plant. Every system, a family farm, a regional economy, an insurance industry, an entire country, has its own equivalent of a growing point, the place from which future recovery becomes possible, provided it wasn't destroyed by a blow aimed directly at it. In many farms and regions, that growing point is still very much alive. Where farmers have gained access to accurate agrometeorological services, where cooperatives have made protective technology available that no single farm could afford on its own, where insurance models have already been rebuilt around current climate reality. In other places, it's under serious threat. Where several difficult seasons in a row have already drained reserves, where insurers have pulled out of the market, where weather infrastructure doesn't allow enough lead time to prepare. The difference between these two groups usually has little to do with the underlying climate conditions themselves, which are often remarkably similar. It comes down to whether the necessary investments were made before the damage happened or not. Earth's climate is still in the middle of reorganizing itself, and that process won't stop next year or in 10 years. It will keep producing events that not so long ago looked like rare exceptions and are now becoming part of the new baseline. Living within that new baseline isn't a matter of choice anymore. It's simply the reality that a farmer in a mountain valley, an insurance underwriter in a distant city, and a shopper standing in front of a produce display all now have to reckon with, even if the connection between the three of them isn't always obvious from where any one of them is standing. Some systems will meet that reality having already done the work of preparing for it. Others will meet it the way growers so often do after a hard night, on their knees in a field at dawn, fingers in the soil, waiting to find out whether the part of the system that matters most survived. The only real question left is how prepared each of these systems will be for the next spring and the next frost, which, based on everything the science currently understands, is going to arrive.